Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion of world economy and India. In the last lecture, we discussed mainly about American economy. Today, we will focus on the backdrop of financial and economic crisis and how to overcome it. There are several mechanisms. We will discuss all about that. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. S.C. Sharma, a renowned economic thinker, and he has been academician for 40 years and has also been principal of Ramlal College and has written 2 books and contributes regularly to national and international journals. So I hope his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. S.C. Sharma for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the CEC for having given me this opportunity to use this platform to put across whatever little I have understanding of the so-called economic crisis or the financial crisis. Friends, yesterday I tried to make you understand that American economy was functioning on free market principle, and between 1970 and 2007 was experiencing occasional recessions and booms, and its growth was largely sustained by the bubbles. Although these booms were based on bubbles, but let us now look at what was happening in the USA and the world before the crisis came onto the scene, and then look for what caused this crisis, how this crisis was different from the earlier crisis, and how it got transmitted to other parts of the globe, and finally what should be done to correct the situation. To just give you an idea that what was happening in the US economy before the crisis came onto the scene, I'll give you certain facts. The facts were the American economy was operating under a deregulated market, and this was awash in liquidity and low interest rates. There was a global real estate bubble. When I say global, which means that the real estate bubble was not only limited to the United States of America, but it was in the European countries also. Now, while on the one hand we had these bubbles which were developing in the not only in the American economy but in the European economy also, bubbles means that the prices were going sky high. That is what was happening in the US economy. But simultaneously, if you look into the deficit, American deficit, that is the fiscal deficit, and also the trade deficit, then you will find that both these deficits taken together, they were giving an indication that America is living beyond its means. That is, the American consumption is more than what America is producing. Now, this type of situation is always a very dangerous situation. Now, why it is dangerous? It is dangerous because today we are operating at a time when the entire system is globalized. Everything is interconnected. Now, that being the case, from where the global growth will come. The global growth will come from global demand. Now, America being the largest economy in the world, and they were living on beyond their means, which means that there was a large gap between what they were consuming and what they were producing. Now the question is that how they were consuming. They were consuming largely on the basis of the borrowed money. They were largely on the borrowed money. It is through that they were funding their consumption. Now, there was a bubble which was developing in the United States markets, and when that bubble burst, the prices immediately came down, the housing prices came down, and those people who had bought those houses, they started feeling the pinch of it, that they started losing. They started losing the entire savings of their lifetime. That is what was happening. That is what they owed to the mortgage companies. That was more than the value of the assets which they had created by buying houses. Now, when this housing bubble broke, then what happens? When the housing bubble broke, then what happens? As I told you that the people who had bought their houses, they started losing whatever money they had, whatever savings they had. But this effect percolated to the banks also. This housing bubble burst. While on the one hand it affected the people who had bought these, but it also at the same time affected the American banks. Now let us see how the banks got affected. Now, as we know that banks always function on the two basic principles. Now, the basic principles on which the entire banking system is based is that they create an efficient mechanism for making payment on the one hand, and the second function which they perform is that they manage, they assess the risk which is involved, and also they manage the risk which is involved in extending loan. And if whenever you find that the banks deviate from this, whenever the banks will deviate from this, that is an indication for any crisis to come on the surface. Now, all these mortgage products which were created by the mortgage companies, they had a very, very specific feature. The specific features were that the mortgage, they had a variable interest rates. Now, when you have a variable interest rate and you do not regulate the banking system, then banks, since their basic motto is to earn as much as they can earn, then naturally they will find certain ways and means to manipulate those products. Now, precisely the banking system what this did, the banking system started creating products out of the mortgage products in such a manner that they tried to bring in as much as complexity they could bring. And it is at this stage what happened was that they used the rating agency to give triple A rating to these products which they are being created, and initially these products were sold to the pension funds, and then later when they discovered that it has enormous profit in it, the banks started using for these products for them also, that is buying and selling. So in the process the complexities kept on. Now look at this stage when the stock market declines, when there is the bubble burst, then naturally the prices come down. Now when the prices come down, and if the banks, those who have indulged into or those who have participated in these financial products, if they are not very sure what is the situation between the product which they have sold and that is and the assets which they have, that is, whenever they are not very sure between the liability and the assets arising out of this product, then what will happen? A. Secondly, when they are not very sure, the other banks will also not be sure. And then it is at this stage the contagion starts. That is the degree of trust and confidence which is required, because the entire financial system is based on the interbank loaning system. And when you discover that there is a problem of credibility, that is, there is a lack of trust and confidence, then it has a effect on the credit market. So starting with the bubble was developing. American economy was, as I told you right in the beginning, the Americans, they had a problem in the imbalances in the they had a deficit, fiscal deficit, they had a deficit on trade account, and then there was an imbalance because this was financed by the Chinese surplus, because as you know that if you are familiar with the international trade, then imports and exports at the end of the day, they are to be balanced. The surplus which is created in one sector of in one region of the world, that has to match somewhere with the deficit on the other side of the world. Americans were deficit on trade account and China was surplus on trade account. So this imbalance was there. So the American economy was operating under these two facts: imbalances on the one hand, and also what we discovered, that is the housing bubble was building up. When this housing bubble broke, then this immediately had an effect on the banking sector. The banking sector, as I told you, initially they were the middlemen between the mortgage companies and the pension funds initially. Then when they discovered that there is enough profit in between, then they started indulging into buying and selling themselves also. That is the greed for profit had started building up in the banking sector also. Now this greed ultimately leads where? From the banking sector, it started creating problems within the banks, interbank problems. interbank problems of trust and confidence. Now leading to a situation where interbank loan either started getting evaporated, or they started charging very high interest rates. Now with both these effects, what will be the impact on the credit market? The credit market started squeezing. Now from here, now when this started happening in the US economy, then US economy entered into a phase of financial and economic crisis. Now our second part which I have to deal with is to look at how it happened. Now in order to look at how it happened, I will take you back to the, as I told you just yesterday also, that in the first half of the first decade of the 21st century, America had two bubbles which got burst. One was the technical stock, the other was the housing stock. Now I'll take you back. I don't want to go more back. I'll just take you back to, I'll make the bursting of the building of the tech stock and its bursting as the starting point to understand the mechanism, how it got transmitted. Now what happens? In the late 90s, technical stocks were roaring, and as the technical stocks were roaring, so was the American economy. If any one of you can recall your memories, this was the time when large number of our own computer experts, the so-called computer experts, either software or hardware, they started finding jobs in the American cities. This was the time when everything was roaring, stocks were roaring, growth was roaring, employment was roaring. If growth is increasing, obviously employment would also keep on increasing. Everyone was very, very happy. Then suddenly what happens? You see, whenever there is a bubble, the bubble cannot continue for long. It cannot continue for long. It has to be corrected. Some corrective mechanism has to be brought into, and this is the job of the regulators. This job was not enacted by the regulators. The result was that between 2000 and 2002, there was a dramatic fall in the technical stock prices. The fall was to the extent of somewhat about around 80%. Now, if 80% stock falls, then what happens? Immediately by 2001, American economy had entered into recession. Now, this recession has to be corrected. Now, whenever any economic system or economy enters into recession, then what are the ways to bring it up? The only way to get over the recession is the Keynesian prescription. That is some degree of public expenditure. Now, this was the time when George Bush Jr. was the president of the American society. So he got this an opportunity and immediately decided to cut tax rates. Now I will not go into the politics of this. I will only limit myself to the economics of this. because it has a politics behind, and I don't want to go into the politics. The economics behind this was that this tax cuts will create some money, and that money can be used for, this money can be spent, and the recession can be overcome. At the same time, the other policy decision by the US policymakers was to bring down the rate of interest. Now, as soon as you bring down the rate of interest at a lower rate of interest, any elementary student of economics can understand that whenever you have low rate of interest, there is a incentive for anyone to go in for investment purposes. Now, if you have a situation where the economy is operating at full employment, the recession has come about only because of the bursting of the technical stock bubble. So there was not much scope for investment. There was not much scope for investment. So there was no scope for investment for this cut in the interest rate. There was no scope for investment in the cut in the tax rates. Now then the money where it should be used. So it only the tech stocks or tech bubble got replaced by another bubble, and this time this bubble was a housing bubble. So from 2004 to 2000, if you look into 2004, 5, 6, 7, American economy and so the world economy was roaring in growth. The world economy was growing almost at a fantastic rate, at a very rate which was as much as 5%. Now, whenever you have a situation that the economy is growing, this means that there is a demand for what you produce. So, which means aggregate demand is also increasing. Now, in this situation, you look at what was happening. As I told you right in the beginning, that Americans were living beyond their means. Their consumption was based on borrowing money. Borrow and consume. Borrow and consume. How would you pay back? How would you pay back? The deficit will keep on increasing. So while American deficit was increasing, Chinese, which were the major exporters to the Americans, their surplus was increasing. So in between the imbalance was being created. And this imbalance had, I'll tell you then what happens. As soon as the housing bubble burst, prices came down. And when these prices came down, since the Americans, they had coined a very novel idea to keep on lending, whosoever comes to you, and this lending was, even it had penetrated into the so-called sections of the society, which is called a subprime section. Now it is that section, subprime, to which you are lending, it is that section which do not have capacity to pay back. In the event of anything happening, anything going wrong, they would be not in a position to pay back. And when so you had a situation of a kind of crisis. This crisis uh, entered into the American system. Now, as I told you in the beginning, that the banks had created a new product from the mortgages. What was this new product? This new product was the securitization of the mortgage products. Now, securitization means that you are combining various different loans from different areas into one product and then selling it. For selling it, they got the help of the rating agencies to put a stamp of AAA rating on these products and then sending it to the market. So now the point which I am trying to make is that in this type of situation, as I told you earlier also, that when the market is failing, then what would be its impact? The market is failing, so the banks were deviating from their core function. Why I say that they were deviating from their core function? I say it precisely because all these products, they had element of risk in that. Now, if you are not in a position to manage the risk properly, only because you want to go in for greed, and then if anything happens, the crisis is bound to be a very severe. So the banks, instead of managing risk, they misallocated capital and also encouraged excessive indebtedness. So the economy was entering into a phase which was added and abetted by the regulators, because for non-regulation of the banking system, the onus lies onto the regulators. Regulators did not perform their duties the way they were required to. And the situation at the end was that America was in a situation that it was not in a position to sustain this unsustainable bubble. So America was not in a position to sustain this particular unsustainable bubble, and then what happens? Now the aggregate demand, look at, they are not in a position to sustain that bubble. Now the aggregate demand, which is essential for growth, would certainly start weakening. And it was weakening for two reasons. A, American society had a very serious degree of inequalities. And inequalities on the one hand and imbalances, global imbalances on the other hand, they were more than enough to have an impact on aggregate demand. Now, as the aggregate demand starts weakening, so would be the aggregate growth. So the global growth started declining. And this is what precisely happened not only in America but in Europe also. Now, I will now deal with the question which would arise out of this. That when I say that there was a global imbalance, that is, America was in deficit, its current account deficit was very high, and there was a current account surplus in China. It was not only in China. If you look into the total reserves, world reserves at that point of time, which were distributed among various countries of the world, then you will be surprised to find that if this kind of imbalance is there, then the chances for revival, unless a very concerted effort is made, the chances of revival are very bleak. Now, as every one of us knows, that there are countries which are known as countries which are developing countries. There are countries whose economies are largely based on oil economies. And there are economies in the world whose economies are based on what we call export-led growth economies. As of today, we can find this type of. Now, every type of economy which I have just now stated, they have some reason or the other to accumulate reserves. For the developing countries, the reason for building up reserve is to guard against the volatility in the era of deregulation. Globalization is the era of deregulation, which I have emphasized time and again. So all developing countries in the world, they had a reason to accumulate surpluses. And the reason lies in the fact that they want to guard against the volatility. This volatility rising out of the deregulated market. If the markets are not deregulated, the volatility is likely to be not as that severe, which will call for you to keep accumulating reserves. The second set of countries which I mentioned before you, they were the oil-rich companies. Now, the economies which are based on oil exports. Now, they are also very certain that these oil prices will not continue to keep on rising as long as they want. Somewhere on the line, something may happen and the prices may crash. What happens then? So these countries, they have a reason to accumulate surpluses because they want to guard against that situation also. Now what happens to why the export-led growth countries are also wanting to accumulate surpluses? Now, before the WTO came onto the scene, these countries, they enjoyed that kind of freedom that whenever they want to shift their investment from one product line to another product line, they could do so. But with the onset of the WTO, that process became, if not impossible, that became difficult. So what do? Now, if they have to remain competitive means that if they are to maintain their exports, what do? They must have something to fall back on. That is, they have to maintain the competitiveness of their exchange rates. How can they do that? The only mechanism through which they can do that is to go to the market, foreign exchange market, sell their own currency, buy and accumulate them. Now, these accumulation process of these reserves, they had a very, very bad consequences. They had a very bad consequences. Now, what are these consequences? Now, because of this accumulation, there was insufficient global demand, which I discussed earlier. And the amount of reserves, if you look at the magnitude, you will discover that every year $500 billion were getting accumulated year after year. See the degree. Now, for some time, America was helping the global demand with debt-based consumption. But that at the end of the day was not found sustainable. Now, from here, what we have understood is that, or what I have tried to put across to you, is that starting with the housing bubble bursting, leading to crisis in the not only in the banking or not only in the financial sector, but also the banking sector per se that got affected. Now, as soon as we had problem in the banking sector, this problem led us to the credit squeezing. Now, whenever you have a situation of credit squeeze, then we have a problem of investment, which will ultimately degenerate into loss in production, which will ultimately lead to loss in production and growth in output. Now, the other side which I told you was rising out of imbalances. And these imbalances and that taken together, America was in a position to sustain the unsustainable by consumption through debt. Now, what happens then from here onward, that how this crisis got transmitted globally. To understand that, I will give you few facts, and those facts are more than enough to give you an understanding how this effect or how this crisis starting in the USA, which people call it that this is a crisis which is made in USA, and from USA it got transmitted to Europe and then onto other countries. Now, what was the mechanism? The mechanism was that if you look into the structure of the mortgages, then you will discover that as much as 1/4 of the US mortgages had gone abroad. So, if US mortgages collapse, then mortgages which have gone to other countries of the world, they will also simultaneously collapse. And this global financial market had become closely interlinked. How? As I told you yesterday also, that the process of globalization was helped immensely by the information technology. So much so that today people say that word is flat. That is, there is no point in saying this continent, this continent, this continent, this continent, or this continent. Everything is interconnected. So when you have the financial markets which are interlinked to each other, then anything happening in one part of the world will immediately get transmitted to the other part of the market. So the European financial institutions, they suffered from buying toxic mortgages as well as from risky gamble they made with the US banks. So this is how it transmitted to Europe. Now, if you look into the European countries, then you will discover that number of European countries were grappling with problems of their own also. It is not only that the American crisis is being transmitted, but there are countries in Europe which had crises of their own making. For example, the housing market in Spain had also developed bubble, and this bubble at the end of the day got worse in Spain also. Similar situation was there in the UK also. Iceland, which is a very small country, they had a very different type of problem, and that problem was that they had a totally deregulated market. So European contingent from America was not only the American transmission, but in Europe they had, some of the countries in Europe, they had problems of their own also. So as the crisis deepened in US and Europe, other countries around the world, they also suffered from the collapse of global demand. Developing countries suffered as remittances from their family members from the developed countries started declining or started evaporating. If they are not working, if they are not earning, then these transfers will get affected. Now, in many of the developing countries, including those where financial regulation was far better than the US, the problem of the real sector were so large that they eventually got affected by this problem also. So to conclude, I'll tell you that the sum total of all this was that crisis spread so rapidly, especially of capital and financial liberalization, which the IMF on the one hand and US Treasury on the other hand, it foisted on these developing countries. That is, all these developing countries were foisted what we call the American style capitalism. And who were the people behind it? The people from the IMF establishment, people from the US Treasury, because if you know the connection between the US and IMF, you will discover that IMF is only acting on behalf of the United States. And if you have kept any regular contact with the newspapers or with what is happening in India, you will discover that every time our Prime Minister is going to the G20 meetings or to the World Economic Forums or our other high officials going to various places, they are only raising questions. They are raising questions on reforms in the International Monetary Fund. That is what they are asking for. They are asking for to bring about changes in the structure of the International Monetary Fund. That is, give as much as a sort of place to the developing countries to have their voice heard on that, and not that they are made to hear the voices of the IMF. Look at the way they have to go with the with either the folding hands or with hands in this manner, begging whenever countries run into crisis to beg for finances, beg for bailouts. So these IMF and the Treasury, they taken together, they were quite largely responsible for having that kind of situation. Now the point is that what do we do? What do we do? I have only two suggestions to make, not only suggestions, but two strands of opinions are available. One is that think of bringing about reforms in creating balances out of global imbalances. Now, how do we do that? It is a question of policy matters. But there is a sense in thinking on these lines, because it is because of this imbalance it has created a very severe dent on global demand. And if we have to improve on global demand, which means if we have to bring back the economies to the growth trajectory, then something has to be done here. And if we are not in a position to think on those lines, then there is a danger. The danger is that in 2008 we had housing bubble. In the late 90s we had technology stock bubbles. These bubbles, housing stock replaced the technology stock bubbles. Now the housing stock bubble may get replaced by another bubble. We may have another situation, or we may have a situation which I am afraid, which none of us would be in a position to accept that situation, and that situation is of what the situation which we had in 1929, which led us to worldwide depression. And then for correcting this worldwide depression, the aggregate demand was brought back only through the Second World War. So that is the situation which the human society, whether they are in America, they are in India, they are in Europe, or they are here, they are there. It is that situation which need to be corrected. Otherwise, Second World War, only Japan experienced the nuclear bomb. Today, how many countries in the world are having nuclear arsenal? Any world war now has a potential to eradicate, to finish humanity from this planet. So therefore, it is very, very important that either those imbalances are corrected, or something else is done so that the world does not enter into a phase of depression. Thank you very much.
And the other opinion, two and opinion is talked about. One is the
No, the other opinion which I have talked about is that you need regulation. You see, any deregulated market, you see, the elementary economics, when I was a student of economics, I was given a teaching in macroeconomics where these trade cycles were taught to us and telling us through the diagrams how the economy is coming into the trough, entering into the recessionary phase, and then starting and then going to the boom. Now, these situations were available in the 20th century also, but they were regulated. The regulation was there. The regulatory mechanism got into the deregulated zone only when the process of globalization came onto the picture. It is the greed of the banking system, of the financial system, that we are in a position to earn how much. Now, this earning went where? This earning went only to few and not to all. So, this greed has to be contained, which means that we have to see how this globalization has to be conducted. And what Joseph Stiglitz said, how to make globalization work. This we have to address. If at all we have to continue with globalization, otherwise it would be better for us if we go back to the Hindu rate of growth.
So, do you think the work on this line has been started as yet to be started? The countries are taking the steps in this line, or they are still bewildered
No,
what to do and not to do?
countries are still groping. You see, right now the problem is to overcome the serious unemployment problem. America, the unemployment problem is touching almost 10%. It is not coming down. Now look at what is happening in Europe. Europe, I in my lecture yesterday, I make it very clear, and I quoted a retired secretary of the Government of India to convey the point that we are entering into a phase where only thing which we can predict is that we cannot predict anything. Now, it is a situation. At the beginning of the 2011, the chairman of the federal and another official, they gave a very they gave hints that the year 2011 is a year of recovery. Now, what did they say at the end? At the end, one said that the recovery is fragile. The other said is uncertain. So, which means throughout the one full year, at the beginning you had a different idea, at the end you came up with something which you never expected. So, and see, it was only yesterday or day before yesterday, the rating agency, Standard & Poor, had declared 9 countries in of the 17 Eurozone countries, they have downgraded them. Now, if that type of situation happens, it is possible that while in the depression of the 30s originated in America, this time it may originate in Europe.
Okay.
So, we have to be very, very careful, cautious,
Okay.
and understanding.
Okay. So, well, friends, with this word we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. S.C. Sharma for giving such an insightful lecture on this topic, world economy and India. Thank you very much.